On May 21, 1927, pilot Charles Lindbergh changed history when he landed from the world's first transatlantic flight. The flight led to fame, which allowed Lindbergh to influence the transportation world with a new idea of commercial aviation. His leadership also opened up the public to commercial aviation and helped to shape the world of flight that we know today.
Flight had always been compelling to humans. Humanity had always wished to be like birds, soaring in the sky, free from worries. Unfortunately, we never had a way to achieve this goal of flight. But all this changed in December of 1903 with the launch of the first airplane. The Wright brothers, born in Ohio, had created the Wright Flyer, the first ever machine-powered, heavier-than-air machine to achieve controlled and sustained flight with a pilot aboard. The brothers launched the plane, and it propelled the world into a new era, called the aerial age. The next decade was full of innovations, from new planes to new engines. Humans could now fly. Flight, however, was still a novelty for much of the world. Planes could only hold 1 or 2 people, and small gasoline tanks led to a lack of flight time. The idea of flight, although exciting, was useless to the general public. Planes were only seen at carnivals and fairs, where daredevils would perform in shows. In the world of warfare, however, airplanes were quite useful. In World War I, airplanes were used to observe and bomb the enemy. One man, however, wanted to change this and make flight a more viable means of transportation for the general public. Meet Raymond Ortigue, a wealthy businessman from France who immigrated to New York. A self-made man, Ortigue became quite wealthy and established in the aviation field. One night, when attending a dinner honoring the American flying ace Eddie Rickenbacker, Ortigue was inspired by a speech. The speech was about the idea of one day linking France and the United States by air. Motivated by this possibility, he offered a $25,000 prize to any man who could complete it. Many men tried, but no one did until the great flight of Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh was born in his grandmother's house on February 4, 1902, in Detroit, Michigan. He moved to his childhood home in Little Falls, Minnesota, where he lived with his parents. Charles was an only child. He was especially shy and enjoyed playing with small mechanical pieces and parts. Charles often played alone. He especially enjoyed exploring the area around his family's farm. One day, however, Charles was exploring when he saw a plane fly overhead. From this point on, in his life, Charles was fascinated with aviation. After completing high school in 1918, Charles enrolled in the University of Madison, Wisconsin, to study engineering. After 2 years, Charles dropped out of college to enroll in a Lincoln, Nebraska flight school. Here, Charles became a mechanic and a daredevil. This eventually led to him wanting to move on into his aviation career. He went to an Army flight school and graduated to become an air mailman, flying across the Midwest. While flying as a mailman, he heard of the Raymond Ortigue Prize for flying across the Atlantic Ocean. He decided, being adventurous at heart, to take up this challenge. Knowing that many others had attempted the challenge and failed, he did a lot of research on what went wrong with these other flights and how to fix their mistakes. With help from financial backers in St. Louis, he built a plane. And even though it was not accommodating for the pilot, it had 2 extra large fuel tanks to make sure he could make it all the way across the ocean. After much planning, he was ready to make his Atlantic flight. On the 20th of May, 1927, he climbed into his plane and took off from Roosevelt Airstrip in New York. On the 21st of May, when he landed in his destination of Paris, France, he made history. When Charles Lindbergh landed, he was met by thousands of people awaiting his arrival. And by the time the crowd cleared away, he had become a hero. After the news of his arrival in Paris had spread to the U.S., the American public felt a new urge to adventure. They were inspired. A good example of this can be seen in 1937 with Amelia Earhart. Amelia was inspired by Lindbergh's flight, and she also sought out to make her own mark on the aviation community. However, Lindbergh's flight also had more immediate impacts as well. Charles Lindbergh's flight made him quite famous, especially in America, and his fame also bestowed him with a great amount of power. When he spoke, people listened, and Charles took advantage of this and used his status to shape the world. Once Charles realized the conveniences and benefits of commercial aviation, he flew around the U.S. on a campaign to present his ideas to the public. He made speeches and showed the people of the U.S. the benefits of commercial aviation. His leadership and advocacy for this newborn idea of commercial flight was important in creating this new field of aviation. An interview with Charles expressed his views on commercial aviation and its future.
This country began slowly. The Post Office Department established an airmail line in 1919, from which grew the transcontinental route. This line has been very successful. It is the backbone of the present contract airmail system, as almost all other routes feed into it from outlying sections. These lines are the basis of future great passenger lines.
Charles Lindbergh continued to promote and speak about the possibilities of commercial aviation, and the whole world listened. He helped to clear up many misconceptions about airplanes and aviation, such as the idea that air travel was dangerous. He also showed the world that flight was a much easier way to link places together. Lindbergh wrote the novel We, which told of his experiences with aviation and his hopes for the future of flight. And even though he was not directly in charge of any organizations or working for any groups, he became a cultural leader through his actions. The fame from his flight allowed him to influence the people's opinion of commercial aviation, which in turn allowed commercial aviation to become more popular and accepted with the community. Charles Lindbergh's flight had effects seen from the moment he touched down to the present day. Following the flight, he became a hero, and from that day on, he became known as the first man to fly non-stop across the Atlantic Ocean. After arriving in Paris, he received the Ortegue Prize, fulfilling the dreams of Raymond Ortegue. Raymond had one day wished to see the United States and France linked by air, and after receiving the award, Charles toured France. He eventually flew back to the United States. Being that Charles was American, he was quite famous here, and Charles realized he could do something with all the fame he had acquired. With backing from the millionaire Harry Guggenheim, he started to tour the country. On his campaign around the United States, Charles began to promote a new idea of his: commercial aviation. Lindbergh used his fame to promote commercial aviation through speeches, talks, and a book of his titled We. Many read his book and listened to what he had to say. He told the world in his books and speeches about his flight and the great advantages to using this new method of transportation. One interview with Charles told of his thoughts for the future of aviation, and one of the many reasons commercial aviation wasn't being used was because people were fearful of it. Charles, having experienced flight himself, assured them that although their fears were rational, there was no need for them, because aviation was perfectly safe. Charles Lindbergh almost single-handedly opened people's minds up to the idea of commercial aviation through the fame of his flight.
As time went on, many established aviation-based companies began to expand to commercial flight, and new commercial airlines began to spring up. Lindbergh's advocacy of flight to the people allowed companies to capitalize on their acceptance of it. Many airmail services began to evolve into commercial airlines soon after his flight. Some of these companies included Northwest, Delta, Pan American, and Transcontinental Airlines. As times and technology progressed, so did airliners. Larger planes were built, and a greater emphasis on the transportation of the people arose. Charles Lindbergh's flight changed the world. An adventurous young man saw a prize offered for flying across the Atlantic and decided to take up the challenge. The fame he acquired from completing his flight led to his advocacy for commercial aviation. Lindbergh showed the world the power of commercial aviation, and he led a reluctant society into the new world of flight. It's quite safe to say that Charles Lindbergh is the father of the flight system we know today.